I will openly, I'm not going to apologize for this actually, but I guess explain. And I know there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot going on in the world of sports, and it's the best time of year. I realize all of that. I will readily admit to having, for the first segment of the show today, not being total clarity in terms of my thought or delivery. And I hope my explanation here makes sense. And by no means is this in any way, shape, or form a plea for sympathy, but rather an explanation of situation and also an exclamation of gratitude. When I was in college, I became a huge reader, an avid reader of Kurt Vonnegut. I read every single thing that Kurt Vonnegut wrote. And absolutely, I loved Kurt Vonnegut books. And I loved that Kurt Vonnegut was from Indianapolis and went to Shortridge. And I knew that Kurt Vonnegut had another Shortridge, not classmate, but graduate named Dan Wakefield, who had written a book that would become a bestseller called Going All the Way, that came out in 1971, I believe, and was a bestseller. And Dan Wakefield did not know Kurt Vonnegut. They were 10 years apart from one another at Shortridge High School. But Dan, when he wrote Going All the Way, sent it to several publishers, including Kurt Vonnegut's. And Kurt Vonnegut's publisher got it, and Wakefield had written in the cover letter that he had been attended the same high school as Vonnegut. So he said to Kurt Vonnegut, would you read this book and let me know what you think of it? And Kurt Vonnegut came back to the publisher and said, you need to publish this book because it will be the most important book of the year, and Dan Wakefield will eventually never even be able to go back to Indianapolis to see the Indianapolis 500-mile race because he'll be that big. And the book became not only a bestseller, but it also became the first movie of Ben Affleck, Going All the Way. But Dan Wakefield was already an accomplished writer before he wrote that book, notably because when he had graduated from college in Columbia, he covered for The Nation magazine the infamous, historic, and watershed groundbreaking moment of the Emmett Till trial. Emmett Till, the young African-American boy from Chicago who was visiting family in the Mississippi cotton fields and was falsely accused of whistling to a woman inside of a grocery store, and thus two men in Mississippi kidnapped Emmett Till and threw him in the river outside of Sumner, Mississippi. And when the trial took place of those men, Dan Wakefield was the writer for The Nation magazine that was sent to cover what was one of the most tragic but important moments in the United States civil rights history. And Dan, to my knowledge, was the last surviving member that was inside the courtroom when the acquittal was announced. A couple of years ago, I was watching the local news, and Dan Wakefield was featured, and he had moved back to Indianapolis. And I knew exactly who Dan Wakefield was, and I had read his book, and I knew his whole story. And my friend Emily Longnecker had interviewed him. And I called Emily immediately and said, do you have contact information for Dan Wakefield? That began a friendship with Dan that was solidified when I had lunch with him for the first time. And the very first thing that Dan Wakefield ever said to me was, I know you're a sports guy, so can you help me out? Because I have the Miami Heat app on my phone and it keeps freezing. And I figured out how to get the Miami Heat app updated for him so he could watch his beloved Miami Heat games. He had been a faculty member at Florida International University and become a diehard Heat fan. And so then he said, would you want to come over to my house and watch the Heat and we can have pizza? And I said, sure. And we got Basbo pizza and I watched the Miami Heat and they won. And he said, well, you're good luck. You want to come back again and watch the Miami Heat game with me and eat pizza? And I said, sure. And that began a streak of 19 consecutive games that the Miami Heat won when I watched games with Dan Wakefield in Indianapolis. And it was, for me, a true treasure and gift to be able to watch games with someone and learn so much about this great city that I knew he loved as much as I do. And one day he said to me, I have a very important question for you. And I said, okay. And he said, do you drink sake? Now, Jimmy, have you ever drank sake?
Once.
Eddie, have you ever drank sake?
I have indeed.
I have never had it until that moment. And he said, but when I was in Japan, people drink sake over important discussions. And I said, okay. And he said, so I have an important discussion. And I thought, what in the world is going on here? So he poured 2 shots of sake. And he said, when I was a young kid at IPS, my buddies and I all made a pact with each other. And that pact was that when we turned 90 years old, we would all go to St. Elmo's Steakhouse and eat steak to celebrate our 90th birthday. And he said, there's only one other besides me of my group that is still around. And I just found out today that he went into hospice. So I'd like to know if you will take me to my St. Elmo's birthday dinner when I turn 90. And I said, Dan, that would be amongst the biggest honors of my life. And we did. And it was wonderful, and St. Elmo was wonderful, obviously. That was a little under 2 years ago. And Dan then said to me, listen, I've got a friend named Don Sawyer, and he is a filmmaker that's doing a film about my life, and he wants to film me back in the courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi. I have not been there since the day that I saw Emmett Till's killers get acquitted. But he wants to interview me inside the courtroom. Would you want to go with me? And I said, yes. And we went and walked into that courtroom, and I watched Dan Wakefield recount the horrors of what he witnessed in the injustices for Emmett Till, and I saw how it moved him, and it was one of the most powerful moments of my life. And while it was tragic, the circumstance that led to it, there was a dichotomy also, because for me, it was so important and poignant to be there and to witness it. And he then told me that one of his dear friends was the writer James Baldwin, and he said, I'd like to go to the White Horse Tavern in New York City and have a beer like I did with James Baldwin one more time. And Don Sawyer went with us and captured and interviewed Dan inside the White Horse Tavern where he had written. About 5 minutes before, and Dan moved back to Miami to live with his goddaughter about 3 months ago. And when the day before he moved, I went to his house in Broad Ripple and took him a photo of his childhood home. And he was all packed and ready to go to Miami. And the only thing left that he had not yet packed was his plaque for being inducted into the Shortridge High School Hall of Fame. And I said, oh, Dan, you didn't pack this. And he said, you know what? Why don't you keep that? And I think he knew what it meant to me that he had gone to Shortridge and been a product of the Indianapolis Public Schools. And so I took it and was honored to have it. About 5 minutes before we were going on the air today, Don Sawyer called me. And I knew as soon as I saw the phone ringing what it was. And Dan passed away last night in Miami. He is, or would have been, 2 months shy of his 92nd birthday. I think that Dan was at great peace with that, and he led a life that was so enriched by experiences, by recording those experiences, by recollecting those experiences, by cherishing those experiences, and most importantly, by sharing those experiences and allowing other people like myself to learn from those experiences. And there is no way, in any way, shape, or form, that I could ever, in word or in writing, account for what he meant to me, what he meant to the people of this town, what he meant to kids that will be able to play in the park that's named for him, what he meant for the example that he led, not only in being able to fairly cover injustices of people that were oppressed, but also, and in addition to that, to doing so with a grace about him that all of us should aspire. And I will forever be grateful to Emily for making that introduction, but I will always be grateful to Dan, and for that matter, as odd as it is to say, for those damn Miami Heat, for winning all of those games and allowing me to eat so much Basbo pizza, and doing so with somebody that enriched my life to the point that I could only hope for a small fraction I could ever allow other people to see enrichment from those in theirs. And he will be missed tremendously. We'll come back and talk sports, I promise.